Okay, so simply put, Lord of the Rings is the single greatest film franchise I have ever seen in my entire life. And I have seen a lot of movies. Not going to get into it, but just trust me when I say I have seen a lot of films, including silent film era films and things from the 1930s and 40s. So, also, I read the Lord of the Rings book before the movies came out when I was a little kid. So when I was about 12 years old, I read the Lord of the Rings book, and then I read it again as the movies were coming out. And so I am familiar with Lord of the Rings as a book, and The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion even. So, as far as the books and the movie is concerned, I actually think that the stories are pretty damn similar, and the movie is a better execution of that story. So, if you want to skip out on the book, I feel like you could watch this Lord of the Rings extended cut, and that would really give you, pretty much the entire story, actually. And there'd be a few little changes, but I don't think anything too extreme, other than the way, the Shire and Saruman and that stuff turns out at the end of Return of the King. But other than that, I'd say it follows it pretty closely. And subtle changes, but ultimately it's all there. So, there are 3 movies, and they're about 12 hours long, and I defy you to try to take 12 hours of movie and edit it down to 1 minute and 23 seconds, but it's not the easiest thing in the world. But it was quite an exercise in trying to figure out how to show The Lord of the Rings in 1 minute and 20 seconds. And it's weird to do that without showing the hobbits or the ring itself or anything, because you just don't have enough time. And there's just too much awesome stuff going on in these movies, so... As far as execution goes, the movies, I've referred to them in the past as a miracle, which is probably, fanboy gushing, where I'm like, no, these movies are like a technical miracle of cinema achievement, when it comes to the model work, the CG work, the stunt work, the sets, the costume design, the music, the cinematography. I don't know if I said that already. Just all of it, the whole thing just works really well. And it does have some weaknesses overall, which I will get to near the end of the review. I'm going to end on the weaknesses, but I'd like to start with the strong suits and the positives. But getting into the plot, basically, Sauron is the bad guy, and Sauron is not a human, and he's not really a ghost. Honestly, reading the Silmarillion, he's much more like a demon, something more like Satan. So really, it's kind of like they're battling Satan and he's bringing hell on earth, for lack of a better way of explaining it. But, Sauron is definitely not a man. Like, God created him as kind of an angel, or a lesser angel, and he just started running amok. And really, this other guy, Morgoth, was running amok before Sauron, and Sauron was his number 2. But none of that is mentioned in the Lord of the Rings films, and I am getting sidetracked. Anyway... Sauron is the bad guy, and they kind of almost killed him by cutting his hand off and stealing his power, which he put into a ring with some magic for a bunch of reasons I'm not going to get into, and the movie doesn't really even get into it that much, actually. It just gives you a crash course of the Silmarillion, or a part of the Silmarillion. So, really, Sauron's got this ring, and he kind of gets basically rocked by men, and he goes back into kind of like ghost form. Like, he can't materialize into skin and bone because they really fucked him up. So his ring falls off his hand, and this guy takes it, but then he loses it, and it basically stumbles, thousands of years later into the hands of a hobbit. And Gandalf the wizard, who... Wizards are also not really men, even though they look like old men. In the Silmarillion, wizards are technically the same class as what Sauron is. So wizards are like lesser angels. They're not really humans. So anytime there's a wizard in Lord of the Rings, and anytime they're talking about Sauron, you really need to think of them as like angels and demons, for lack of any closer parallel. I'm serious. Like, as far as reading the Silmarillion and getting the backstory, like, they really are like angels and demons that are on Earth, and they're fucking around. But the wizards are supposed to be fucking around for good to combat Sauron, so... Gandalf basically figures out that this is Sauron's evil ring, and that they gotta get it out of the Shire and do something with it, because while Sauron is in ghost form, he's still like the devil, and he's capable of, like, really crazy crap that's violent. So... that's basically the plot of Lord of the Rings, is we got to get this ring from this hobbit's little house in the middle of nowhere back to Mount Doom, which is this volcano, and it's the only place where you can destroy the ring, because basically it's Satan's ring. It doesn't make any sense when you're like, why can't they destroy this ring anywhere? But if you're like, it's Satan's magical ring, you're like, all right, fair enough. They got to go to the one magical place to destroy the magical ring. I'll buy it. So that is essentially the plot of Lord of the Rings. It's a quest movie. It's an adventure movie. And along the way, you meet a lot of, I hate to call them secondary characters, because they end up getting like 2 to 3 hours of screen time in a 12-hour epic. But there's a lot of secondary characters. And before I get into the whole character structure, I'd like to stay on track with the movies real quick. But essentially, the movies are 12 hours long. They're a quest movie. They get progressively more epic across all 3 movies, to the point where the 3rd movie really does blow your mind the first time you see it, and that they really just they keep upping it. And the action scenes are incredible, and they are the best PG-13 action scenes I think we're ever going to get. So, you know, they beat everything I had seen beforehand, and 10 years later, they still are destroying even movies like the first 2 Hobbit movies. I'm sorry, but, like, no one who's seen Lord of the Rings is like, yeah, those 2 Hobbit movies are way better than Lord of the Rings. Like, no one is even remotely thinking that Hobbit trilogy is going to be better than Lord of the Rings. Because Lord of the Rings has the action, it has the adventure, it has the horror, it has the romance, it has the courage, it has the fear, it has the pain, the suffering, it has the villainy, it has the heroism, it has a lot of fulfilling concepts in the movies themselves as a whole, and it's really, I was trying to do these movie reviews individually, but like honestly, doing the extended cuts and watching all of them, a lot of these character development story arcs and a lot of these plot points take all 3 movies to kind of wrap themselves up, and so it's really hard to talk about, say, Boromir's character from Fellowship of the Rings, when in the extended cut of Return of the King, you see so many more scenes with him. And even Two Towers, there are more scenes with Boromir where there are these flashbacks with him. And so it becomes hard to talk about Boromir singularly from Fellowship of the Ring when I know that you learn a lot more about him from the other movies. So then it became, okay, I gotta review all 3 of these in one go. Because I feel like the character development and the character arcs that these guys go through is really what makes Lord of the Rings my favorite film franchise of all time. Like, yeah, it's got sweet action and amazing cinematography and really good music, and it's an adventure swashbuckling epic, which typically I prefer, and it tends to be what I like more than anything in movies, is like guys with swords riding horses. So Lord of the Rings is really awesome if you were into Gladiator or even Braveheart or something like that. But going into character development, in Lord of the Rings, you'll see multiple characters go through the exact same problems, and you will see those same characters take 2 different paths to solve the problems, and then you will also see the outcome. So, as an example, you have Theoden, and Theoden is the king of Rohan, and when you first meet him, his son is dead, and he acts like a jerk. And basically, for all of Two Towers, which is the second movie, and that's where Theoden is introduced, he's kind of an asshole, and you kind of don't like him. Then, when Return of the King comes out, you meet Denethor, and Denethor is the king of Gondor, and his son died, and he's an asshole. So you have 2 kings who just went through their sons dying, and they're acting like assholes. Now, by Return of the King, Theoden has really decided that, you know what, rather than wallow and suffer in my son's death and just be a quitter, I'm going to go out like a champion and just kick ass for days. And that's basically what Theoden decides to do in Return of the King, and that's how he goes about dealing with his son's death. Rather than, just kind of go into mourning and pity, he's like, I'm not going to let my son die in vain, and I'm going to kill as many of them as I can, or I'll die trying, and it doesn't matter. Like, that was Theoden's kind of response, which is overtly masculine and very manly. Now, Denethor, on the other hand, becomes a sniveling fuck, and he becomes all suicidal and just gives up. And he goes through the exact same problem that Theoden goes through, but you see that Theoden solves it like a man, and then you also see that Denethor does not, and he solves it like, really cowardly, and it's just a really helpful lesson to see that there are multiple ways to go about doing things, and that, there's a preferred way and an unpreferred way, and that's essentially A lot of people don't like Denethor's character, but I really like that Denethor is in Return of the King, because without him, you wouldn't realize that that's how Theoden responds. Like, if it was just Theoden by himself, you'd be like, yeah, that's how you respond to the situation. But Denethor shows, no, that's not how everyone is going to respond to the situation. Some people are going to do this and panic. So it's really good to have examples of people who are being brave in the face of danger and fear, and other people who in the face of danger and fear just completely punk out and run away. And, it's really, really helpful. And these guys are old men, so that's like the old man example of the character arcs that are going on, because both of them are old. Then you got the younger guys, and you have Boromir and Faramir. Now, these two guys are brothers, and Boromir is the older brother, and Faramir is the younger brother. And we meet Boromir in Fellowship of the Ring. And when we first meet him, he's from Gondor, and he's talking about how, you know, they're on the front line of Mordor, and they're constantly getting killed, and they're constantly fighting. Meanwhile, people back at the Shire, or the Elves, they have a peaceful existence, and that really the people of Gondor are dying to keep the rest of the world safe. So that's kind of where Boromir comes from. And then Boromir tries to steal the ring from Frodo, because he wants to take it back to Gondor, and you really think he's kind of an asshole over this move, but immediately when he fails, he feels regret, and he feels really bad, and he actually starts to cry, which is kind of a wussy move. But then, like 2 minutes later, when the hobbits are about to die, he goes into complete beast mode, and basically dies the most manly, best death I have ever seen in any movie ever. Like, unless you're going to do like a non-fiction movie based on a true story, like as far as a fictional movie goes, Boromir really has a profound death in Fellowship of the Ring. And it is one of the most, it's just a really intimate, personal scene. And it is so well executed. Like, it is truly one of the best death scenes ever in cinema history. And that is the way Boromir dies. So Boromir dies kind of like Darth Vader, in a way where you're like, you know, just because he was a jerk doesn't mean I'm going to hate him, because he died like such a champ and really tried to do the right thing and feeling really bad for doing the wrong thing. So you have pity on Boromir, and you meet Faramir later on in the movie, and Faramir is the younger brother, and he's a bit of a dick, but ultimately he does let Frodo go, and he doesn't try to steal the ring from Frodo, is the point. Boromir tries to steal the ring from Frodo when he finds out that Frodo has it down the road, and Faramir, when he finds out Frodo has it, like, he contemplates stealing the ring, but really he changes his mind and he lets Frodo go, and that's ultimately what happens in the book, is that he lets Frodo go on his quest, and he doesn't try to take the ring, unlike Boromir. So Faramir's the younger brother, and he seems far less lusty for strength and power. But then when you see Faramir's home life, his dad Denethor hates him. Like, absolutely hates him. Loved the fuck out of Boromir, who was like, you know, the manliest man ever, and just thinks Faramir is just not as impressive. And really, he's just totally awful to Faramir. He tells Faramir that he'd rather him have died than Boromir, and then he sends Faramir off to his death. And, you know, Faramir is literally just trying to do the right thing. And Faramir is a great character in Return of the King. And he's really